So we saw yesterday how the story of the Bible is the story of the presence, how you and I were created for God's presence, how we lost it through our rebellion, and how God is still pursuing us through the nation of Israel and the Messiah to restore his presence with us. And yesterday we saw how God wants to dwell with his people. And so Israel built a tabernacle and a temple, which God came and he filled it with his presence, with his spirit. But God had something even better in mind. The tabernacle and the temple were symbolic of the greater temple that would one day come when God would come to tabernacle or dwell with his people. And we see in the book of John that God came to dwell with us in Jesus. And in John 1, we see that Jesus was with God in the beginning. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then John says that this Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. John says that no one has ever seen God, but the one and only Son, who is himself God and is in closest relationship with the Father, and he has made himself known to us. So Jesus came to show us who God is and to make a way for us to dwell with God again. In Jesus, God has come closer to dwell with us and restore the presence of God in our lives.
And I love how we see God doing this, constantly breaking through the obstacles that have come between us and him so that he can reach us, so that we could know him, so that we could belong to him. And yet sometimes those obstacles are not simply the circumstances of life or even the consequences, like sin created a major obstacle that God broke through. Sometimes the obstacle that comes between us and God is the limitation of our perspective. Us trying to understand how God moves, how he works, how he can speak to us. And so I love that as we start this year, we're spending so much time in this series on learning to hear God's voice, because it's something that doesn't always come naturally to us. Every culture throughout the history of humanity has wrestled with trying to understand this, has had challenges in terms of its own beliefs that oftentimes get in the way of helping people understand how God works. And the reason why is because every culture is broken in one way or another. Our culture is broken. Like, we live in a culture that is a blender of ideas that are oftentimes competing with one another. And depending on how we're caught up in our own cultural views of life and reality, that could hinder or hurt our ability to see how God might move or act in our lives. And these blended ideas can quite often limit our ability to understand. So if somebody leans more naturally into a supernatural view of life, that's actually pretty helpful. But one of the challenges with that is if we begin to impose our view of spirituality or our view of who God is onto God, as if we would come to God and tell God how he should work or who he should be, instead of letting God reveal himself to us. The danger of that is thinking that we know better than God. Another challenge is if in our view of life, we lean more into a naturalistic view of reality, meaning that all that exists is matter. There's nothing else or nothing beyond. That's going to really limit our ability to understand how God could work or move or speak, possibly because we may not even believe God exists, or if we did believe in the possibility, God is somehow beyond our ability to understand. In our reading, Dallas Willard picks up on this idea as he was speaking about this. On page 95 in the reading, he writes this. He says, "We may seem to have imposed on us a picture of reality in which humanity is encapsulated within a material world. God, if he really exists, is pictured as being wholly beyond the material world, which for its part seems to run without God. So given such a view of things, one of the most difficult issues we face in trying to learn to think about hearing God concerns the how of it all. And so we ask the questions, well, how can God work? How can God move? How could a God who's so big enter into our world? How could a God care about me? We ask how. And it's an obstacle. It's the limitation of our perspective. And yet what's interesting, something really important to recognize about whenever we ask the question how, whenever we ask how about anything, it only reveals one thing: our ignorance. So when we ask, how can God move? How can God speak? It's a good question, but let's recognize what it means. It just means we don't understand how God is able to work or move. So why would we let our ignorance determine what God is able to do? Now, oftentimes we'll ask the question how, and it's actually revealing a much deeper obstacle. So we'll ask how almost like a smokescreen, like we think we've asked some clever question. In reality, all that's revealing is something deeper going on, and that's our own arrogance. Somehow we think we know better, even though we don't really know. And so we'll ask how to hide the wrestle of what we may not know. It'd kind of be like if I were to say, like, I don't know how my engine works, and so my car doesn't start one day, and I said, like, well, I guess it's over. Well, that's just my ignorance. Now, if my arrogance stepped in and said, like, therefore I don't have to do anything with my car, that just doesn't make sense. Or suddenly I come into this moment where I realize how my engine works, and then I think, well, therefore I don't need an engineer who created this. Arrogance is such a tricky thing because it will deceive us into thinking we know more or know better. And we need to be careful with arrogance because Peter writes that God opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. And so when we ask how, let's ask with a humble heart. Let's ask our questions with humility, and let's just be honest about the fact that we have some ignorance as we're trying to figure it out. So what if we didn't let this obstacle, this limitation of our perspective, this wondering how God could actually speak, determine our willingness to lean in and see what God is capable of doing? And what if with an open mind and a humble heart, we ask God, how? And in doing so, we would learn to listen as God chooses to speak.
You know, it's easy for us to accept the natural world around us, but because of Jesus, now we have a choice. Do we want to go through life only seeing things in part, or do we want God's vision for our life, seeing the reality of the natural and the spiritual? And in our reading today, we saw the story of Elisha, where Israel was at war. They were surrounded by their enemies on all sides, and Elijah's servant is freaking out. He's afraid that they're about to be conquered. And Elijah responds with this beautiful response to him. He says, "Don't be afraid. Those who are with us are more than those who are with them." And then Elijah prays for his servant, and he says, "Open his eyes, Lord, so that he may see." Then the Lord opened the servant's eyes, and he saw the hills and his enemies were actually outnumbered by the angels, by the Lord's angel army, the chariots of fire and the horses that far outnumbered their enemies. And you know, at first Elijah's servant, he only saw part of the story. And the truth is that if you and I aren't careful, we can be the same way when it comes to hearing God's voice. And so our prayer for you today is that your eyes would be open to hear and see the Lord speaking to you, that God's presence would be restored in your life, that he would remove any obstacles that are getting in the way between you and him, and that he would show you that he is actually closer than you know, and that he is still speaking today. So let's come to Encounter ready to hear his voice. See you soon.